The process of reproduction in higher plants starts with the production of flowers. Once the mature reproductive organs, stamens and pistils develop in the flower, the next process is pollination. In pollination, the pollen grains carrying the male gametes are transferred from the anther to the stigma of a pistil. The pollen grains germinate on the stigma, grow through the style and release the male gametes in the ovary for fertilization to occur. Transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the same flower is called self-pollination. Majority of the flowers have cross-pollination, in which the pollen grains of one flower from a plant are transferred to a flower of another plant. Cross-pollination is dependent on external agencies for transfer of pollen grains from one plant to another. The external agents can be abiotic without involving any organism, like pollination through wind and water, or biotic involving pollinators like insects, birds, bats, etc. The morphology of the flowers is often related to the type of pollination adapted for fertilization. There is a close relationship between the groups of insects and the type of flowers they visit, which also indicates co-evolution of certain plants and insects. Let us see in detail about pollination. Plants belong to two broad groups on the basis of type of pollination. They are either self-pollinated or cross-pollinated. When the pollen grains are transferred from an anther to the stigma of the same flower, or when the transfer takes place between two flowers of the same plant, then it is called self-pollination. When the pollen is transferred to the female part of the same flower, it is called autogamy. When the pollen is transferred to another flower, it is termed Dichogamy. The male and female reproductive organs have to mature at the same time for self-pollination to occur. This condition is referred to as synchronous hermaphrodism or homogamy. When the plants can pollinate and fertilize themselves, they are self-compatible or self-fertile. Self-pollination is common in short-lived annual species and plants that colonize new locations. Peaches are self-pollinated commercial crop. Some plants produce bisexual flowers that do not open and carry out self-pollination within the flower. This type of self-pollination is called cleistogamy, a Greek word meaning closed marriage, as opposed to chasmogamy or open marriage, where the flowers open and do cross-pollination. Cleistogamy is observed in plants like peanuts, peas and beans. Viola is the best example of cleistogamy. Under adverse conditions, cleistogamy is advantageous because it uses less resources of plant for reproduction and propagation. Development of petals, nectar and large amounts of pollen are not required in cleistogamy. Plants like impatiens, capensis produce cleistogamous flowers on unfavorable sites for maintenance of population. The disadvantage of cleistogamy is suppression of production of genetically superior plants. Cross-pollination or allogamy is most common in plants since it produces genetically strong offspring. Cross-pollination is the transfer of pollen from stamen of one flower to the stigma of a flower on another plant of the same species. The flowers which are adapted to cross-pollination prevent self-pollination by various methods. Dicliny or unisexuality. When the flowers are unisexual, cross-pollination is inevitable. In monoecious plants like maize, the male and female flowers may be born on the same plant. In a dioecious plant like mulberry, the male and female flowers are borne by separate plants. Dichogamy. In some bisexual flower, the anther and the stigma mature at different times to avoid self-pollination. If the gynoecium or the female reproductive organ matures earlier than stamen, it is termed protogamy, like in magnolia. If the androecium or the male reproductive organs mature earlier than gynoecium, then it is termed protandry, like in sunflower. Heterostyly. Some plants have two types of flowers, one with long stamens and a short style, and another with long style and short stamen. This is known as dimorphic heterostyly as seen in oxalis. Heterogamy. In some flowers, stamens and styles lie at some distance from each other. For example, in iris, the anthers are inserted within the corolla while the style is far extended. When the transfer of pollen from one plant to the other or pollination is mediated without the involvement of any organism, it is abiotic pollination. Wind and water are the two types of media used in abiotic pollination for the transfer of pollen. When the flowers are pollinated through wind, it is termed anemophily. Grasses, sedges, rushes and catkin-bearing plants are in general pollinated by wind. Pollination by wind is not a very precise method because only a small portion of the pollen carried by the wind will have a chance to land on a suitable receptive stigma. These plants produce a large number of dusty pollens to be carried by wind, a large portion of which is wasted in the environment. In these plants, flowers are inconspicuous and not showy as they need not attract any organism like insects for pollination. They are also devoid of scent and nectar. The flowers of cereal plants are wind pollinated. Flowers of wheat, barley, maize and sorghum produce a large number of pollen grains like dust particles in the anthers. Pollens are also very light and easily blown by the wind. Their stigma is branched, bushy and feathery like in maize, so that they can easily catch the pollens from the air. Besides cereals, anemophily is also found in palms and trees like poplar, willow, alder, elm, urtica, etc. In Urtica dioica flowers, the anthers burst and surcharge the air with pollens. In anemophilous trees, the flowers are borne when they are devoid of leaves, so that the flowers are fully exposed to wind. Pollination by the transport of pollen through the media of water is termed hydrophily. This type of pollination is limited to aquatic plants. The pollens may be transported underwater in completely submerged plants like Nias and Ceratophyllum, and the pollination is hypohydrogamous. In plants like Vallisneria, Hydrilla and Elodia, the pollen is transported on the surface of the water and the pollination is epihydrogamous. In Vallisneria, the male and female flowers are borne on separate plants. The female flowers have a long pedicel and remain attached to the plant, while the small male flowers detach and float on the surface of the water. The detached male flowers cluster around the floating female flower, and when the anthers burst, the pollens get attached to the stigma. After fertilization, the pedicel of the female flower coils back and the fruit develops inside the water. Not all the aquatic plants use hydrophily type of pollination. Instead, water plants like water lily and lotus use biological pollinators like insects. The most common process of pollination is through the pollinators or the organisms that carry and transport the pollen grains from one flower to another. The pollinators are also called as biotic pollen vectors, and pollination is carried out by insects, although other organisms like birds, bats and rodents also act as pollinators. Animals visit the flowers to obtain their food in the form of nectar, fleshy parts of the flower, or they may also consume pollen grains produced in large quantity. Flowers develop the characters like colors, scent, nectar, etc. that can attract pollinators. There is often a specific relationship between the flower and the pollinator. The flower traits that differentially attract one type of pollinator or the other are known as pollination syndrome. The pollinators are divided into several groups on the basis of the nature of the pollinator. Flowers are the most attractively colored and strongly scented parts of most of the plants. This is an adaptation to attract insects for pollination. The insects are the largest group of pollinators, and this type of pollination is termed entomophily. The group includes bees, wasps, ants, beetles, moths, butterflies and flies. The close association between insects and flowering plants has led to the theory of coevolution, that is, evolution of flowering plants along with the evolution of insects. Insect pollinated flowers have sticky pollens with a rough surface, which makes it easy for them to stick to the legs of the insects. The stigma is also sticky with exudates so that it can easily receive the pollen. Insect pollinated flowers have some common characteristics to attract the insects, and the association is for mutual benefit. They can be listed as follows. Conspicuousness. The flowers become conspicuous by their attractive colors. The floral parts, whether they are petals or perianth, are always brightly colored. If not the petals, then the sepals or bracts or the leaves around the flowers may become brightly colored. In Bougainvillea, the bracts are brightly colored. In Poinsettia, the leaves are brightly colored. Besides the individual flower, the inflorescence also makes them conspicuous. The sunflower is an inflorescence of many florets. According to Miller, certain insects show preference to certain colors. Bees prefer blue flowers and butterflies prefer red flowers. Scent. Most of the flowers are fragrant, although the ability of the insects to distinguish fragrance is not known. Some flowers like chameli, ratkirani emit a strong scent in the night, and they are known to be pollinated by night flying moths. Rarely the flowers may emit obnoxious odor to attract pollinators, like in Rafflesia flower, which emits a nauseous odor to attract flies. Nectar. Nectar is an important attractant for the insects to visit flowers. Honeybees collect the nectar from flowers and convert them to honey. In the process of collecting nectar, the insects carry the pollen grains that get attached to their body from one flower to the other. Nectar glands may be present at various parts of the flower, like in thalamus, at the base of sepals, petals, or carpels. Nectar is often concealed in the flower to make the insect search for the nectar within the flower and in the process get thoroughly dusted with the pollen. Often, certain spots and lines on the petals converge towards the nectarines and are supposed to guide the insects towards the nectar. Sometimes, nectarines are present on extrafloral parts like leaves and stipules and are meant to divert unwanted insects. Edible sap. Some flowers which do not have nectarines secrete edible sap for the insects. Flowers of the plant Orchis morio secrete edible sap. Edible pollen. While nectar is full of sugars, is a source of energy, pollen produced in large quantity is a source of protein. Bees collect pollen grains to nourish the younger bees. Special mechanisms. Some insect pollinated flowers exhibit special mechanisms for the dispersal of pollen grains by the insects. Irritability. This feature is shown by anthers and stigma of certain flowers. In the flowers of the plant Bignonia, the stigma is bifid, that is, it has two flaps and it closes its flaps when it comes in contact with an insect. If it is not pollinated, then the flaps are opened again. The flower of Centaurea bends and exposes its stigma on being touched by an insect. Explosive mechanism. In some flowers, the anthers burst and discharge the pollen grains whenever they are touched by the insect. Ballistics. Versatile stamens and other balancing characters, like in the flower of Salvia, help in the dusting of the pollen. According to these characters, Stamens and the nectaries are the two important features of a flower that attracts insects. The flowers which produce a large number of stamens and a large quantity of pollens are grouped as pollen flowers. The flowers of argemone, poppy, anemone, magnolia, annona, water lily and potato belong to this group. The nectar flowers are those visited by the insects for the nectaries. There are different types of insects and also different types of flower structure. Amongst the insects, butterflies and moths have the longest tongue. Bees and wasps have short tongues, and in other insects, tongues are too short. Accordingly, depending on the length of the tongue, the insects can reach the nectaries stored either deep down in the flower or the open nectaries easily reachable. We can classify flowers on this basis as flowers adapted to short-tongued insects. Beetles, thrips and bugs are short-tongued. They feed on the flowers of the plants belonging to families Rutaceae, Vitaceae, Umbelliferae, Euphorbiaceae, etc., which have fully exposed nectaries. They also visit plants of the families of Brassicaceae, Rosaceae, Ranunculaceae, etc., which have partially concealed nectaries. Diptera flowers. Diptera are small feeble flies that carry out pollination by crawling into flowers. They visit the flowers for shelter, unlike other insects which visit the flowers for gaining pollens or nectar. These insects are attracted to nauseous smelling flowers rather than scented flowers. Some of the nauseous flowers are found in plants like arum, maculatum, amorphophallus, campanulatus, Alocasia indica, Colocasia esculentum, etc. In the plant Colocasia esculentum, flowers emit strong stinking odor during night. The female flowers are located below in the spadix inflorescence and the male flowers on the top. Flies crawling up and down pollinate the flowers. Flowers of Rafflesia arnoldi also emit evil smell and attract carrion flies. Some flowers possess special traps for Diptera flies. In the plant Aristolochia clematitis, the flowers are protogynous, that is, the female reproductive part matures earlier than the anthers. In the young stage, the flower is upright and the insect crawls down the corolla tube, pushing the downward pointed hair. Once inside, they are trapped and cannot come out until the flower matures and hairs wither away. The anthers mature by the time stigma wither away and the flower droops down. The anthers burst and smear the insects with pollen before they come out. The insects smeared with pollen pollinate the stigma when they enter another younger flower, since stigma matures earlier than anther. After pollination, they again get trapped until the anthers mature and smear them with pollen. Hymenopterous flowers. Flowers of this group are pollinated by bees and wasps, members of the Hymenoptera insects. Although they pollinate a large number of flowers, red, blue or violet colored zygomorphic flowers predominate. They visit all types of flowers with nectar. Flowers with open nectaries like in orange, Flowers with fully concealed nectaries, like in members of Papilionaceae, aggregated flowers with concealed nectar, like in members of Compositae, and flowers with long tubes with nectar hidden below. Some of these flowers are also visited by butterflies. Within this group, some interesting mode of pollination are found. In Salvia, a member of Labiatae, the corolla is bilobed. The upper lip is formed by the fusion of two petals and the lower lip by the fusion of three petals. The lower lip acts as the platform for the insect and the upper lip encloses the reproductive organs. The flower has two stamens which mature before the carpel. The short epipetalous filament of each stamen is connected to the peculiar distractile connective which is long and lever-like. The two unequal arms of the connective separate the two antherlobes. The basal lobe of the anther is sterile and the upper lobe is fertile. When the bee alights on the lower lip while entering the flower, it pushes the united lower antherlobes and brings down the fertile upper antherlobe, which dusts the pollen on the back of the bee. When the carpel matures in these flowers, the stigma protrudes down out of the upper lip. When the bee enters a flower with mature stigma, it pollinates the flower with pollen dusted on its back. In fig, that is Ficus carica, flowers are enclosed in a hollow pear-shaped hypanthodium inflorescence. There is a narrow orifice for entering the receptacle within which there are three types of flowers: male, female and gall flowers. The male flowers are situated on the top near the orifice, while the long-styled female flowers and the short-styled female gall flowers are lower down. Figs are pollinated by gall wasp, which crawls into the receptacle and lays eggs inside the ovules of the gall flowers, which it can easily reach by its ovipositor because of the short style. The eggs develop into larvae and feed on the ovules and form galls. After passing the pupa stage, the larvae develop into mature wasps and crawl out of the fig. While crawling out, they brush against the male flowers near the orifice and carry away the pollens on their bodies. When they visit another fresh inflorescence, they pollinate the long-styled female flowers in their process of laying eggs on the gall flowers. In orchids, the flowers are peculiarly adapted for pollination by bees. In these flowers, pollens are aggregated into pollinia and is present on the top of the stigma. When the bee alights on the conspicuous labellum of the perianth, being unable to enter the opening in front of the gynostegium, sends its tongue into the spur to reach the nectar below. The head of the bee pushes against the stigma in this process, and the pollinia on top of the stigma gets stuck to the forehead of the bee with their sticky discs. When the bee visits another flower and similarly brushes against the stigma, the pollinium gets stuck to the stigma, carrying out pollination. In Calotropis of Asclepiadaceae, flowers have gynostegiums formed by the fusion of prismatic stigma with the androecium. The pollinia gets stuck to the proboscis or legs of the bee and gets carried by the bee. The flowers are pollinated by the sticky pollinia when the bee visits another flower. Lepidopterous flowers. These flowers have the longest corolla tubes, and the nectar below the corolla can only be reached by insects having long tongues like butterflies and moths, which belong to the group Lepidoptera. The flowers of this group, like lily, lavender, nyctanthus, polyanthus, jasmine, nicotiana, etc., are sweet scented. Amongst these, the night flowering plants are pollinated by moths and the day flowering plants by butterflies. Pollination by organisms other than insects is included in this group. Birds and bats are the main pollinators of this group, and rarely snails, rodents and reptiles also carry out pollination. Ornithophily. Pollination by birds is termed ornithophily. Plants that use birds as pollinators tend to produce copious nectar and have red petals. Birds like hummingbird and honey thrushes feed on the nectars of flowers of plants like Bignonia carpiolata and pollinate them. A honeybird, Nectarina afra, pollinates large flowers of the plant Strelitzia. In our country, flowers of trees like Salmelia and Bombax erythrina are pollinated by crows and miners. Chiropteriphilly. Pollination by using bats is termed Chiropteriphilly. These plants typically have white flowers, a strong scent, and they flower at night. These type of plants are also pollinated by moths in the night. Bats pollinate flowers of trees like Bauhinia megalandra and Aperua falcate. In our country, trees like Anthocephalus chinensis and silk cotton are pollinated by bats. Malacophily. Pollination by several other types of animals is classified as malacophily. Snails and slugs pollinate many of the aroid flowers. Squirrels found on several trees also have a role in pollination. Rarely, reptiles like lizards can also be pollen vectors, especially in island systems. A lizard, Paracris lilifordi, is a major pollinator of the plant Euphorbia dendroides. Some rodents of South Africa are also pollen vectors. Certain species of the plant Protea like Protea humiflora, Protea amphlexicolis, etc., bear eastly smelling and not colorful flowers near the ground. Rodents like Cape spiny mouse and elephant shrews visit these flowers for nectar and pollinate them. The nectar of these flowers has a high content of xylose, which the mice can digest but the birds reject. Some of the commercial plantations need pollinators in large numbers during the period of flowering, since the number of naturally available pollinators may prove inadequate. Because of monoculture of crop plants, greater concentration of pollinators are always needed at bloom time. Pollination management is a branch of agriculture that seeks to protect and enhance the present pollinators. For example, New York apple crop requires about 30,000 beehives. Maine's blueberry crop requires 50,000 hives, and Californian almond orchards use 1 million beehives during bloom time. Rearing and supplying pollinators is also a part of agriculture. Bees are also used in commercial plantings of cucumber, squash, melons, strawberries, etc. Greenhouse tomatoes are pollinated by using bumblebees. Decline in pollinators due to pesticide overuse and misuse is an environmental concern. Habitat destruction and climate change also add to decline in pollinators. Under artificial pollination, the pollen grains from one flower are collected and transferred to another flower by human intervention. Mendel experimented with pea plants using artificial pollination to study the inheritance of characters. Artificial pollination is used by the plant breeders to obtain inheritance of desired characters in hybrids. Hybrid crops have the desired characters like high yield, disease resistance, tolerance to stress, etc. Pollination is an important natural process required by plants to ensure gene mixing and continuation of generation. A mutualism exists between insects and angiosperm flowers, in particular, which ensures food for insects and cross-fertilization of plants. This association has guided parallel evolution of plants and insects. Decline in pollinators is an environmental concern.